When you think of Japanese cars, you probably think of something similar to your daily driver Honda Civic, and honestly, you wouldn't be far off from wrong. But what if I told you Japanese car culture goes much more in depth than just your daily driver Honda Civic right off the shelf? It's about a form of uniqueness, expression of oneself, and most importantly, the competition when racing. And I'm here today to explain to you all about the Japanese car culture, and using my four sources, I have developed enough information and I'm able to now explain this to you. Using my sources such as Kelly from June 5th, 2018 on Japan car culture, Garlados, May 14th, 2020 from Top Speed, Lopez Valito on November 20th, 2017 from Drive Tribe, and FAM, July 20th, 2020 from Road and Track. And using these sources, I'm fully capable of explaining to you just how far different Japanese car culture is from here in America. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was the tune culture. So the tune culture is a matter of modifying the engine, the handling, suspension, and the brakes and tires, really just the whole car to create as much performance as possible. And the engine, for instance, in the 80s and 90s, companies like Nissan, Toyota, Honda, all these Japanese brands, they found that people really love to modify their own cars. So they made these engines as tunable as possible, able to handle as much power as possible because they just worked and they worked correctly. As they do now, they haven't really changed much just because it works. A lot of times though, a lot of people will just take out the old engine even and they'll put a bigger one in their car. So that way it allows for more torque off the line, which basically means it's going to have quicker acceleration from zero to going. Next, I want to talk about the handling and suspension. Handling and suspension is obviously very crucial for racing. And a lot of times people put kits like wide body kits or spoilers to create the best handling and downforce as possible to create the sharpest turns as possible. Now the suspension comes into play with top speed and acceleration. Having a stiffer acceleration, unlike yours, which is probably very soft and comfortable in your daily driver car, the stiffer suspension allows for, it's going to be much bumpier of course, so much more uncomfortable, but higher top speed and higher acceleration, and that's all what it's about, is just performance. Next we have the brakes and tires. And the brakes and tires are obviously very crucial like it is to you, but these ones are obviously going to be much more higher performance, higher grade, and of course more altered towards the street driving and racing versus your daily driving. So tires and brakes obviously replaced much more common than what you see in your car. Now, let's get into the racing aspect of things now. This is where Japanese car culture really takes off in its own direction. They actually invented drifting in the 1960s in the mountains of Japan. People found out like, hey, we can drift around these really tight corners and it's actually pretty fun. People enjoyed it. So people tended to race drift down the mountains and that's how they did it. And eventually drift racing became part of street racing because when you drift, the whole goal is to keep as much momentum going for as long as possible on the turn and keep that momentum when you continue in the straight line. Street racing is also very different than what we see here in the US just because of Japan's highway systems. The most famous one is the Wangen, and that one is on the coast of Japan, stretching 38 miles long, and at nighttime it's actually very heavily abandoned, and so because of that, it creates a perfect spot for street racers to, well, race. And finally, this leads me to the Midnight Club. The Midnight Club was an elite group of wealthy businessmen in Japan, and they had one goal in mind: to reach the highest top speed and go as fast as humanly possible in their vehicles. But they did it differently with one priority in mind: safety, which it sounds very weird coming from people street racing at 190 and above miles per hour, but it's what they did. And in order to get in the Midnight Club, they allowed only 10% of members throughout the entire history of it to be entered in, with no more than 30 members at a time. And in order to get in, your car had to maintain a speed of 160 miles an hour, although cars regularly maintain in races above 190 miles an hour. Finally, we have the body art, and this is by far the most unique thing about Japanese car culture. And the biggest one is probably from the otaku. Otaku, in direct translation, it means nerd, essentially, in English. But in the Japanese car culture overseas, it means you're essentially just a huge car enthusiast. Next, we have kei cars. Kei cars are by far the most unique part of Japanese car culture, with them being essentially a minivan but scrunched together and smashed down. So they're super tiny, only hold about 4 people, and they only have about 68 horsepower. Most cars today that are daily driven have about 150, 200 about. So as you can see, they're kind of like nothing, but they're so small with so many people in Japan, it makes them so easy to just drive around. And with them being so cheap and so common, there is an incredible aftermarket for kei cars, allowing for the highest amount of customization with as far as making your vehicle just as unique as possible. And that's what it's all about, just making your vehicle your own. And finally, we have the term Yankee that I wanted to go over. So Yankee is actually spelled Yankii, not the same Yankee that we'd see here, Yankeye. But what it basically means is originally it was delinquent bikers who were extremely loud with their flashy bikes. But over time, they actually became much more accepted in the community, and now they are actually part of the culture. It's crazy just how it makes that adjustment from rebellious to part of it, you know? But that essentially covers all the main aspects of Japanese car culture, and I'm assuming you're probably not looking at the Honda Civic too much differently than what you used to, but every single time you see a racer on the road, some car, Honda Civic or any Asian car, that's going to be extremely loud, you know exactly what they're going for.